Family, hear me as I speak this with fire in my bones. This is not an ordinary Sunday. This is the day the Lord himself has marked for mercy, to find you and restoration, to locate every broken area of your life. Wherever you are, lift your expectations, because when God steps into a day, the impossible becomes the next testimony waiting to happen. I don't know what followed you into this morning. Burdens, battles, delays are silent tears. But I hear in the spirit that mercy is rising like a mighty flood, sweeping away every verdict, every shame, every limitation that has held you back. Today, God is rewriting stories. Today, he is restoring strength, restoring joy, restoring opportunities, and restoring what you thought was lost for good. Prepare your heart, because as we pray, the hand of God that lifts, the hand of God that settles, the hand of God that restores will rest upon you. This Sunday will not pass like others. Something is about to break open for you. Something is about to shift. And before this day ends, you will know the God of mercy and restoration has remembered you. When we declare that today mercy will overturn every negative verdict, we are not making a casual statement. We are announcing a spiritual reality that carries weight, authority, and divine urgency. Mercy is not an emotion. Mercy is a force. Mercy is the very character of God stepping into the affairs of men and rewriting what the enemy thought was settled. When mercy appears, darkness loses its grip. When mercy arrives, judgment is reversed. When mercy speaks, every other voice becomes silent. And when mercy rests upon a person, what condemned them yesterday becomes the reason God lifts them today. Mercy is the intervention of God, where human effort is no longer sufficient. Mercy is God saying, I will do for you what you cannot do for yourself. And today, that mercy is not only available, it is actively pursuing you. There are seasons in life when the weight of past mistakes or the consequences of decisions made in weakness begin to hover over a person like a cloud. You may feel like you are living under a verdict, spoken or unspoken. A verdict of failure, a verdict of delay, a verdict of stagnation, a verdict of shame. There are verdicts that circumstances place on people. Verdicts that seem to conclude, this is all your life will ever be. But mercy refuses to let the story end where pain tried to stop it. Mercy breaks the pen from the enemy's hand and gives God the final say. Mercy takes what was supposed to bury you and turns it into the foundation of your rising. It takes what was designed to disqualify you and uses it to showcase the goodness of God. And this is why today's declaration matters. Because when God's mercy is released, no verdict is final, no conclusion is permanent, and no situation is beyond redemption. There are people who have walked under the shadow of words spoken against them. Sometimes it is the words of people. Sometimes it is the words of systems and structures. Sometimes it is the whisper of the enemy. Sometimes it is even the voice of your own guilt and regret. But mercy speaks louder than every voice of accusation. Mercy interrupts the conversation of condemnation and announces a new beginning. Mercy does not ask for perfection. Mercy flows because God is compassionate. Mercy does not wait for you to earn it. Mercy moves because God has chosen you. Mercy does not wait for circumstances to improve. Mercy steps into the very place that seems the most hopeless and turns it into the very place where God's glory shines the brightest. There are verdicts that appear legal and justified. There are verdicts that seem to have evidence backing them up. The enemy likes to present a long list of failures, weaknesses, and errors to justify why a person should remain where they are. But mercy does not respond to evidence. Mercy responds to the covenant. Mercy responds to the love of Jesus that speaks better things. Mercy responds to the love of God that has no shadow of turning. Mercy responds to the commitment of God to lift his people even when they fall. So even when the evidence suggests that failure is the logical outcome, mercy overrides logic. Even when the path of restoration seems impossible, mercy carves out a path where none existed. Even when the situation looks irreversible, mercy creates a reversal that no human plan could have orchestrated. Some battles in life are not won by strength, strategy, or intelligence. They are won by mercy. Some doors do not open because you have the right qualifications. They open because mercy has gone ahead of you. Some breakthroughs do not manifest because you have prayed the longest. They manifest because mercy has decided your time has come. Some victories do not come because you fought harder than others. They come because mercy stepped in and fought where you could not fight. And today we stand under the canopy of that mercy. Not the mercy of yesterday, not the mercy of last month, but the fresh, immediate, present mercy of God that is flowing into this moment with the assignment to overturn every negative verdict. There are people who have been told that their future is limited because of their past. There are people who have been told they do not deserve a second chance. There are people who have been made to believe that their mistakes are greater than God's ability to restore. But mercy rises today to challenge that lie. Mercy rises to say that no human being has the authority to decide the limits of your destiny. Mercy rises to declare that what God has ordained for you cannot be cancelled by human judgment. Mercy rises to break the power of regret, the power of shame, the power of guilt, and the power of fear. Mercy lifts your head where life tried to bow it. Mercy strengthens your knees where discouragement tried to weaken them. Mercy positions you again where failure tried to push you out of alignment. When mercy overturns a verdict, it does not merely neutralize the negative, it establishes the positive. It does not only remove what was against you, it releases what is for you. It does not only silence accusations, it amplifies divine favor. It does not only undo the wrong, it prepares the ground for unprecedented right. Because mercy is not just defensive. Mercy is transformational. Mercy does not leave things as they are. Mercy brings them into alignment with God's will. Mercy restores dignity. Mercy restores identity. Mercy restores confidence. Mercy restores hope. And today, that restoration begins by overturning every verdict that has been working against your advancement. Some verdicts are spiritual, some are emotional, some are psychological, some are financial, some are generational. But no verdict is too deep or too ancient for mercy to uproot. Where there has been a verdict of delay, mercy declares acceleration. Where there has been a verdict of denial, mercy announces approval. Where there has been a verdict of lack, mercy releases provision. Where there has been a verdict of sickness, mercy introduces healing. Where there has been a verdict of failure, mercy establishes success. Every verdict that has spoken negatively over your life, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or unconsciously, mercy rises today with a full authority of heaven to overturn it. There is a realm realm of mercy where battles stop without explanation. There is a realm of mercy where doors open without negotiation. There is a realm of mercy where enemies step back without confrontation. There is a realm of mercy where God begins to orchestrate events that position you for testimonies you did not even know how to pray for. That realm is present today. That realm is hovering over you. That realm is what God has summoned to operate in your favor. Mercy does not need a long process to work. Mercy can break cycles in one moment. Mercy can silence storms in one command. Mercy can rewrite a narrative in one divine intervention. And today, as this word is released, something begins to shift around you. The atmosphere adjusts to the presence of mercy. The spiritual environment realigns to the sound of mercy. The verdicts that have stood against you begin to lose their authority. The chains connected to those verdicts begin to weaken. The doors that were closed because of those verdicts begin to open. Because where mercy stands, opposition bows. Where mercy flows, darkness retreats. Where mercy speaks, breakthroughs answer. Every negative verdict, every judgment, every conclusion that has positioned itself against your destiny begins to collapse under the weight of mercy. Today is not just another day. It is a day marked by divine intention, a day where heaven has chosen to intervene, a day where God has chosen to make a statement over your life. And that statement is simple. Mercy has won the case. Mercy has overruled the accusation. Mercy has overturned the verdict. Mercy has taken your file and stamped it with divine approval. Mercy has stepped into your story with the authority to redirect your path. And from this moment, the influence of every negative verdict begins to dissolve, making room for the full manifestation of God's goodness, favor, and restoration in your life. When we declare that restoration is returning everything that was stolen or delayed, we are announcing a divine mandate, a supernatural recall order from heaven that refuses to let your destiny remain incomplete. Restoration is not merely receiving back what was lost. It is God stepping into time, circumstances, and situations to recover pieces of your life that were scattered, withheld, damaged, or buried. Restoration is one of the strongest signatures of God's mercy, one of the clearest expressions of his power, and one of the most undeniable proofs of his commitment to your journey. When restoration is released, what you thought was over finds new breath. What you assumed was gone forever begins to reappear in ways that only God can orchestrate. And today, restoration is not a promise pending approval. It is an active move of God, searching for the areas where your life needs divine recovery. There are people who have lost time, opportunities, relationships, confidence, faith, or joy through battles they never asked for. There are seasons where life feels like it has taken more than it has given. Delays that drained your strength, failures that stole your boldness, doors that stayed shut longer than your heart could understand, people who walked away without explanation, resources that disappeared when you needed them most. And sometimes the greatest loss is not material. Sometimes it is a silent loss of inner peace, identity, self-belief, or direction. But restoration comes from a God who does not look at the ruins of your past and walk away. Restoration comes from a God who examines the broken areas and declares them repairable. Restoration comes from a God who visits the years that looked wasted and reassigns fruitfulness to them. Restoration is God's way of saying, I have not forgotten you. It is his way of proving that delay is not denial and that loss is not the final chapter. When God restores, he does not just return things as they were. He returns them in a greater measure, a better quality, a refined version. Restoration is compensation wrapped in mercy. Restoration is God giving back the harvest that your battles tried to sabotage. Some attacks were not intended merely to frustrate you. They were intended to rob you of what God had planned. But restoration comes to say that the enemy cannot have the final say. The enemy cannot keep what belongs to you, and the enemy cannot hold hostage the blessings assigned to your name. There are seasons when delay becomes a thief, not because you did something wrong, but because the timing of life seemed to work against you. The years passed, the opportunities slipped, the strength you once had began to weaken. The momentum you once carried began to fade. But restoration is God returning what delay tried to swallow. Restoration is God gathering scattered seasons and presenting them back to you in one moment of breakthrough. It is the divine ability to redeem time that seemed wasted, time in pain, time in confusion, time in stagnation, time in waiting. Restoration does not ignore the years that were lost. It confronts them and demands repayment. These are the years that were lost. It confronts them and demands repayment. Everything that was stolen, whether by spiritual attack, human manipulation, personal error, or circumstantial misfortune, is never truly out of God's reach. Restoration means God has tracked every detail of what slipped out of your hands. Nothing is missing in his record. Nothing is lost in his memory. Nothing is able to bring it back in his system. Whether it was taken silently or violently, God is able to bring it back. Whether it disappeared gradually or suddenly, God is able to return it in greater measure. Restoration means nothing stolen stays stolen when God rises. Nothing delayed stays delayed when God intervenes. Nothing broken stays broken when God rebuilds. There are people who have lived under the weight of unfulfilled promises. Not because the promise failed, but because circumstances seemed to stretch the manifestation farther and farther away. But restoration is heaven's announcement that the cycle of delay is breaking. Restoration is God gathering every pending promise and pushing it into your present. Restoration is God collapsing the distance between prophecy and manifestation. Restoration is God breathing life into what became dormant. Restoration is God revising what seemed expired. Restoration is God rescuing what looked dead on arrival. Restoration also touches identity. There are people who lost who they were somewhere along the journey. Pain reshaped their personality. Betrayal hardened their heart. Rejection made them doubt their worth. Failure made them question their purpose. But restoration comes for the inner man. Restoration comes to rebuild the strength that was drained by disappointment. Restoration comes to repair the confidence that was damaged by criticism. Restoration comes to revive the joy that was buried under years of survival. Restoration is not just external, it is internal. It is God restoring the version of you that battles try to destroy. Restoration touches relationships, not only romantic, but destiny relationships, supportive relationships, connections that were God ordained, but prematurely disrupted. Some relationships were stolen by misunderstanding, pride, manipulation, or attacks that came to separate you from people meant to push you forward. Some relationships were delayed because the environment was not yet mature enough for them to thrive. But restoration brings alignment. Restoration reconnects what heaven approved. Restoration heals wounds that kept people apart. Restoration opens doors for the right people, the right mentors, the right partners, and the right helpers to find you again. Restoration also touches resources. There are finances that were lost to wrong decisions, unwise partnerships, or unexpected crises. There are career doors that shut without warning. There are business opportunities that collapsed before they birthed profit. But restoration means God is not only returning resources, He is returning capacity to manage them, capacity to multiply them, capacity to sustain them. Restoration is not merely the return of money, it is the return of wisdom, stability, and divine positioning that ensures the returned resources do not slip away again. And restoration touches spiritual fire. There are people who once prayed with passion, but life storms exhausted them. People who once believed without doubting, but delays made their faith faint. People who once served with joy, but battles weakened their zeal. Restoration is God rekindling spiritual flames that hardship tried to extinguish. It is God returning hunger, intimacy, clarity, and sensitivity to His voice. It is God renewing the anointing that seemed dim. Restoration is revival. On a personal level, when God restores, He restores in layers. He restores visibly and invisibly. He restores slowly in some areas and suddenly in others. But every move is intentional. Every action is precise, and every restoration carries the fingerprint of His goodness. Restoration is not random, it is targeted. It hits every area where the enemy tried to create a void. It addresses every space where loss created fear. It fills every gap delay created, and it strengthens every foundation that life tried to weaken. Restoration is God's way of saying that your story is not over. Restoration is His declaration that the enemy miscalculated. Restoration is His announcement that there is still more to be written in your life. Restoration is His assurance that nothing you lost disqualifies you from receiving what is coming. Restoration is His reminder that His plan for you cannot be cancelled by anything you went through. Restoration is the proof that heaven has remembered your name, your tears, your sacrifice, your journey, and your destiny. And as restoration begins to move, everything that was stolen begins to hear the command to return. Everything that was delayed begins to hear the command to appear. Everything that was broken begins to hear the command to rise again. Restoration does not leave your life the way it found it. Restoration steps in as a fierce, loving, unstoppable force that gathers every scattered piece of your destiny and brings them back into wholeness, fullness, and divine alignment.